We're ready to get started. I just turned off the sound on my phone because I just remembered. So if anybody else didn't remember, please go ahead and take a moment to turn that off. I am Karen Novak. I'm Associate Dean and Chief of Staff for WashU's Continuing and Professional Studies School. It's a pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a memorable event, one of the highlights of OLLI's year. We're delighted to have a vibrant and diverse audience joining us today, not only from across the United States, but also from the United Kingdom. We are hosting this event via Zoom webinar format. We want to remind our online guests that while we can't see or hear you, we do value your participation. The chat feature is enabled, so please feel free to share any thoughts that you might have. We look forward to engaging with you virtually. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce someone very special to us. Judith Freedman, the daughter of our beloved founder, Henrietta Freedman, is here with us this afternoon. The Freedman Fall Address was established to honor the remarkable legacies of both Henrietta and Judith's father, Rudolph Freedman. Judith and her husband, John Lawrence, have traveled all the way from England to join us, and we are incredibly grateful for their presence. Before we begin our lecture, Judith will share a few reflections on the significance of this event and the legacy of her parents. Please join me in giving a warm and heartfelt welcome to Judith Freedman.
Well, hello and welcome, lifelong learners. It's great to be here with you again. And I want to welcome you not only here in person, but wherever you might be streaming from in St. Louis, including hello, Gatesworth, and wherever you might be streaming in the United States, from California to Chicago, to Washington, D.C., to New York and New Jersey and Boston. And then in the United Kingdom, from London and from Manchester, and in Italy and in Israel. We're delighted to have all of you here with us. We were particularly wanting Krister to give this talk because his area of specialty is conflict, and conflict is of great concern to John and me and was to my parents. So our heart is breaking for what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and conflict is so much of the moment in the United Kingdom and in the United States, as well as in Ukraine and Russia. And I thought I might just bring home Krister's topic about how perpetual it is to tell you that I had always heard from my mother that her family came from Russia. And in the last year, I learned from my cousin David, who's the family genealogist, that my grandmother Sophie came from a village called Kupel, and my grandfather Joseph came from a village called Kulchini. So of course, what did I do? I Google mapped them. They are midway between Lviv and Kyiv, so very much in Ukraine, and they are 43 kilometers apart. 43 kilometers is the distance from the Gateway Arch to the now closed Chesterfield Mall. That's how long it would take to walk between them. But Sophie and Joseph had to come to St. Louis to meet each other. So we're pleased to be here. And I'm going to hand over to John.
It's a great pleasure to see everybody again, and welcome to our online guests. Every year, Washington University never fails to bring us extremely good and distinguished people for these talks. We think up all sorts of topics, and we just ask them if there's anybody they can supply, and they do. And this today with Dr. Knapp is no exception. Dr. Knapp is a teaching professor. Some people have asked me what that is, but I think most of us know, at the Department of History at Washington University, where he offers courses in national security, including the Cold War, US-Russia relations, and the great power competition, which I didn't know what that meant, but it means the constant competition between the three great powers of which this country is one. It's a very Orwellian concept, I thought. At the moment in London, there's an art exhibition of Ukraine art from the early 20th century. In fact, there's also another exhibition of expressionist paintings, same style, same genre as the Ukraine one in the Royal Academy. And they're both from the early 20th century. But Ukraine, of course, had troubles with Russia in the early 20th century, the same sorts of troubles, as far as I know, of trying to establish its own nationalism against a country who was wanting to subsume it, to dominate it, to make it, just part of itself, which Ukrainians have never wanted, as far as I can see, although I don't know the history of the country. So we're delighted to have Dr. Knapp, and I shall be pleased to hand you over to him. Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay. All right. I'll take this one.
Yes. Shall we do a quick sound check? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. You're going to be a lifelong learner. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, John, Judith. It's quite a tale, quite a story. Thank you for traveling and being here. Thank you all, honored guests and online around the globe. I'm very honored to have this privilege to be this year's annual speaker for the Freedman Address, and I'd like to thank the Osher Institute for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about Ukraine, and the title of my talk is Perpetual War in Ukraine, which means I've told you my argument at the beginning. Let me spend the next few minutes trying to tell you why I think there will be perpetual war in Ukraine. We will assess the possible futures, but I'll have several components to this talk. First of all, we'll have a historical recap of the last 2.5 years. We will look at the war's costs, and the costs have been very high. And then we'll look at the current situation. That will then put us in a position to assess the possible outcomes moving forward and to examine my argument that there will be perpetual war in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Or at least that is the outcome that I think is most likely, because no one knows what the future will actually hold. Now, I'm not going to address the long origins or the causes of the war, as those have been fleshed out pretty well by now, but I'm happy to take questions on those in the Q&A, should you have them. But in particular, I want to begin today by exploring two main questions, as we often do in academia and inquiry. And that is, what is the state of affairs in Ukraine today, and where are we most likely headed? And my view is that there is unlikely to be a clear or determined end to this conflict, because despite laudable efforts to aid Ukraine, there is no realistic scenario in which Ukraine wins this war, by which I mean the Ukrainian armed forces militarily pushing Russia all the way out of Ukraine. That seems very unlikely to me at this point. At the same time, There are scenarios in which Russia could win militarily, by which I mean conquer all of Ukraine. But I think that so long as Western aid remains forthcoming, and there are structures to make sure that aid does keep coming, the scenario of Russia winning completely is also highly unlikely. Now, this observation is not unique to me. Many analysts have concluded that a military victory by either side is not on the immediate horizon. Instead, they have argued that a negotiated settlement is the most likely outcome. Now, at times, I have found myself agreeing with that very intuitive answer, and perhaps you have too. After all, don't all wars end in negotiation? But in fact, a cursory look at recent wars suggests that since World War II, many wars don't end in negotiation. In fact, they don't end at all. They just go on in a different form. Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea, and others. So I don't think we're actually going to get a negotiated settlement. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. The most significant underlying structural reality that we're facing is that neither side can win militarily, but neither side is willing to negotiate a meaningful peace. A meaningful peace. They're not willing to do either or can't do either of those things. And until one or both of those things happen, we are likely to have more of the same. As such, we should not succumb to the illusion that this conflict will eventually culminate in negotiations, but instead, alas, steel ourselves for a long and bloody conflict without obvious end. That is, perpetual violence for the foreseeable future in Ukraine is the most likely outcome, thus making the war in Ukraine the next forever war. Now that's fairly serious and pretty dark. Some might even say cynical, and I don't come to these conclusions lightly. So before I actually give you my full argument for why I think that, let's do a historical recap and look at the costs in the current situation. So as you all know, the war in Ukraine has lasted 2.5 years so far. Like most wars, it is complex and has evolved over time, as it has played out in several ways, including a grueling, grinding ground campaign, small traditional air campaign, drone warfare, a small naval war, even though Ukraine lacks a navy, and a massive war of information and propaganda. Espionage has also played a crucial role, including up to 9 secret US spy bunkers that are located in Ukraine that have supplied the Ukrainian armed forces with invaluable intelligence. So too has the use of commercial satellites owned by members in the private sector, such as Elon Musk, who have allowed Ukraine to access his network Starlink. And open source intelligence by citizens all over the globe, but especially in Ukraine, who are seeking to help Ukraine, has also played a key role. Mostly, the war has pitted Western-backed Ukrainian armed forces against Russian forces, though some mercenary forces have also been used. Now, until recently, almost all of the fighting had been on Ukrainian soil, with most of the combat occurring in the 5 eastern provinces called oblasts: Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, especially in the area that we all know as the Donbass, which includes large chunks of Donetsk and Luhansk, which Russia invaded covertly and then occupied in 2014 after it annexed Crimea, starting a low-intensity war 10 years ago that killed at least 14,000 fighters and civilians before the Minsk I and Minsk II ceasefire agreements in 2014 and 2015 respectively, which lowered the level of fighting, but did so without fully ending or resolving the conflict. In fact, the failure to resolve the conflict at Minsk is what led 7 years later to Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. We should not be talking in terms of 2.5 years of war. We should instead be talking about 10 years of war. That's one of the first pillars of the argument that this war will go on for a long time. But it's really just the beginning. Now, really, I think for purposes of ease, we can break down the war into 4 main phases since 2022. Now, the first was the initial Russian invasion that lasted a few weeks. It involved Russia's 9-pronged invasion of Ukraine from the northeast, east, and southeast that was designed to take all of Ukraine by military force, overthrow the Zelensky government, capture or kill any remaining opposition, install a puppet government loyal to Putin, and make Ukraine a vassal state of a newly constituted Russian empire. And here I give you the first slide here of the 9-pronged attack from the north, northeast, east, and southeast. Now, this invasion ultimately failed because of the Ukrainian armed forces' superior strategy, logistical planning, and fighting adaptability that prevented Russians from making the Hostomel airport outside of Kyiv a base of operations, which in turn saved the capital, saved the government, and it also failed because of poor Russian planning and logistics that denied its troops continual ammunition, supplies, and thus occupational power, forcing the Russians to halt their movement toward the capital. That meant Russia's main objective, to take all of Ukraine, had failed in just the first few weeks, really the first few days. The second phase of the war was a Ukrainian counteroffensive that occurred in the first 3 months of the war from February through April of 2022. In this phase, the Ukrainian armed forces routed bogged down Russian forces north of the capital in a series of ambushes and then forced the remaining Russian troops to retreat from Ukraine's interior out to its perimeter, stretching from Kharkiv in the northeast, which Russia occupied for a time, to Kherson in the southeast, which they captured for a time as well, even crossing the Dnieper River at one point in a daring raid from Crimea that almost saw the Russians build a land bridge all the way to Odessa from Mykolaiv, but which the Ukrainians ultimately prevented. This meant that Russia had failed not only to overthrow the government in Kyiv and failed to occupy the country, but now failed to hold the land that they had initially taken in the original invasion. This is a map of how far Russia got in its initial invasion. And by the way, I should say almost all of my maps come from the Institute for the Study of War, a well-known think tank in Washington, which many people use in their presentations. In the salmon color is the extent of how far Russia got, and in the blue you begin to see the Ukrainian pushback around Kiev and then out toward the northeast sections. Now, several high-profile events occurred during this phase, including the sinking of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Navy, which the Ukrainian armed forces struck with 2 Neptune anti-ship missiles in April 2022, and this forced the Russian Black Sea naval fleet to retreat to Sevastopol, safely out of reach. There was also a 3-month-long siege of Mariupol, in which Russia shelled the city to ruins in order to capture it, and which ended in May 2022. And this forced the surrender of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, the third phase of this war lasted 3 months from May 2022 through July 2022. So just the first 6 months is all we're really talking about here. In this phase, the Ukrainian armed forces continued to push back Russian forces in the northeast away from Kharkiv and eastward toward the Donbass and out of Kherson in the south and areas near Zaporizhia, and also toward the Donbass, leading to the area that Russia has controlled or contested ever since. And so here I give you 2 maps, the situation of the war in April 2022 and the situation of the war a month later in May 2022. And you can see how Ukraine gradually pushed the Russian troops out of the capital area and then out of the northeast, and all the way to the 4 oblasts, or overlaps of those oblasts, but particularly in the Donbass, that Russia either occupies or contests. Those green circles you see on your map are areas of fighting at the time. And the Institute for the Study of War, which you can look online, updates this map regularly. And so you can follow the actual fighting and what areas are controlled almost daily. Now, several high-profile events occurred during this phase, including Ukraine's retaking of Snake Island, a strategically located island 28 miles offshore, which the Russians had occupied for 126 days from the beginning of the war, and that had allowed them to shell Odessa and enforced a naval blockade against Ukraine grain ships that were bound for the Mediterranean, but which now gave Ukrainians upper hand, despite not having a navy. Ukraine then armed and fortified the island to prevent any further shelling of Odessa and to ensure the free flow of commercial shipping in and out of Ukraine. A major strategic win for Ukraine, in essence, making the Russian naval forces in the Black Sea impotent, yet another defeat for Russia. Ukrainian armed forces victories in Kharkiv, Kherson, and Snake Island meant it had fully prevented a Russian military takeover of Ukraine and limited the fighting to eastern Ukraine in these 2 to 4 oblasts. After 6 months of war then, the Ukrainian counteroffensive had succeeded in pushing back and containing the Russian forces. This is a very impressive feat and is why I recount it for you. Finally, the 4th phase. In the 4th phase has been ongoing ever since you see these 2 maps, since July 2022. And this is the fight in eastern Ukraine, primarily in those 4 oblasts, which over time have consolidated along a 600-mile-long front in which neither side has been able to break through decisively. And so here we can look at July 2022, and you can see the Ukrainians have shrunk that area a little bit further, and in July 2022, just over 2 years ago, we're on the offensive once again. Now, like the previous phases, this phase also witnessed several high-profile events, including a massive and brutal World War II style artillery fighting mixed with drone warfare, and several major events that have caught our attention then, including the Wagner Group's assault on Bakhmut in the summer of 2022, which was some of the worst urban fighting since the battles of Fallujah in Iraq in 2004, and the bloodiest fighting on the continent of Europe since World War II. It has even drawn comparisons with the Battle of Verdun in World War I. That's how bloody this has been. In October 2022, the Ukrainian armed forces used maritime drones to strike and damage the Crimean bridge that passes over the Kerch Strait, connecting mainland Russia with Crimea. That's in the lower right-hand corner of your slide there. And that has allowed Russia to supply its troops in Crimea. And they have been stationed there ever since 2014. Now, that attack slowed the resupply for a time, but it also demonstrated how a smaller power can use smaller and cheaper weapons to fight asymmetrically to weaken a great power, Russia, thus revealing its soft underbelly. Now, this phase was followed by the much anticipated but ultimately failed Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. In this phase, the Ukrainian armed forces, despite having massive amounts of Western supplied arms, such as tanks, armored vehicles, and 155mm shells, failed to take any substantial ground south of Zaporizhia. And so once again, if we move from July 2022 to the end of July 2023 and into July 2024, a year after the counteroffensive, you see things are virtually unchanged. And if you go back several maps, you'll see that line, that 600-mile line, by the way, is about the distance from St. Louis to Minneapolis, is virtually unchanged over the last 2 years. So this is sort of where we stand, right? And so there was Russia's costly taking of Advitka, a small, strategically unimportant but symbolically significant town in the Donbass, where the Ukrainian armed forces and Russian forces had been battling since the beginning of the war, and which the Russians finally captured at great cost in blood and treasure in February 2024. Of course, this 4th phase also witnessed Yevgeny Prigozhin using his Wagner military forces in a failed rebellion against Moscow in June 2023, leading to his demise and the restructuring of paramilitary forces such as Wagner throughout the Russian national security establishment. Now, despite these important high-profile events, as I mentioned, the line of control hardened and progress for both sides was slowed significantly. As of May 2024, Ukraine has recaptured 54% of territory initially taken by Russia. But Russia still occupies and has been unmoved from 18% of Ukraine in the last 2 years. 4/5 of the time they've been at war. They've been in this scenario. Many think then that we have reached an impasse. Former Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny has called the war a stalemate, quote unquote, after Ukraine's failed counteroffensive in November 2023. Others have called it a dynamic stalemate, suggesting some fluidity to the fighting. But military technicians say that this is not quite right, and that instead they insist that what is really happening is what is known as positional warfare. In positional warfare, each side invokes a strategy to find a tactic that attempts to position manpower and weapons to exploit the other side's vulnerabilities and thereby break through the logjam. Where along this 600-mile might the Russians or the Ukrainians respectively find a weak point they could break through on? However, the game is not equal, right? The two sides are not equal in strength and numbers. It's very important to point out that Russia today outnumbers Ukraine 5-1 in manpower. 5 Russian soldiers for every 1 Ukrainian one, and 10-1 in artillery rounds, shells, mortars, and weapons. Russia simply has more, a lot more. But Ukraine has better military leadership in the field, better strategy, logistics, and especially high quality adaptability, innovation, and definitely much more willpower to fight. In this way, the Ukrainians are really fighting asymmetrically to keep this situation in balance. Nonetheless, the two sides have been bogged down on the front with no major breakthrough in sight, much like in World War I. As many have noted then, this is a 19th century war fought with 20th century tactics using 21st century weaponry. Let's talk a little bit about the costs because they've been very high. Indeed, the costs have been astronomically high for a conflict of this proportion. In blood, there were 500,000 casualties as of August 2023, roughly 300,000 of which were Russians, 120,000 killed, 180,000 wounded, and 200,000 of which were Ukrainians. But the number is surely higher since there has been intense fighting over the past year. One report says that Russia lost 70,000 forces in just May and June of this year. In 2 months, 70,000 forces. By comparison, the US lost 60,000 forces in Vietnam over 8 years. Yeah, exactly. So another report shows that Russian casualties are now approaching 500,000, right? Just on their side. At this rate, it is not hard to realistically imagine that the total number of casualties surpassing 1 million by the end of this year. It's just not hard to imagine that. Now, in treasure, the war has cost Ukraine and Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. Nobody knows exactly how much. The total number of destroyed tanks, armored vehicles, and other military hardware runs into the tens of thousands that are littering the steppes of Ukraine. Western military experts estimate that the war has set back Russia's ability to modernize its military at least 2 decades, thereby decreasing Russia's long-term military power, which will contribute to Russia's overall decline. And make no mistake, Russia is a great power in decline. The impact on ordinary Ukrainian lives has been immense. The war internally displaced 8 million Ukrainians and forced another 7 million refugees. By comparison, at the end of World War II, there were 15 million displaced persons wandering around Europe. We have that many coming out of Ukraine alone in this conflict. Now, most of them went to Eastern Europe, European countries, with Poland bearing the lion's share. Out of a population of about 38 million people, that amounts to just under 40% of Ukrainians that have been forced to flee their homes. Some have returned, but many still have not, and many will never. As of February 2024, over 30,000 civilians have been killed, according to the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it is much likely higher, though, due to the UN's known tendency to underestimate numbers. Indeed, the US Defense Department estimates the civilian casualties at 40,000. But whatever the number is, it's high. In addition, Russia carried out forcible transfer of between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians. They've stolen Ukrainians and brought them back into Russia against their will, including 260,000 children, which amounts to a war crime under the 4th article of the Geneva Convention and has been part of a broader ethnic cleansing program to rid Ukraine of pro-Ukrainian nationalists. As John mentioned at the outset, Ukrainians want to be Ukrainians, not Russians. Beyond that, an unknown number of both Ukrainian and Russian young men have fled their countries for fear of being forced to fight and are starting anew in places such as Turkey and even as far away as Bali, Indonesia, where there are growing Russian and Ukrainian diasporas. The destruction of infrastructure and property is almost beyond comprehension, and we've all seen this in the news over the years. It's along the lines of World War II. Russia's massive shelling of Ukraine's many cities in the east, most infamously Mariupol, has destroyed countless numbers of buildings, roads, bridges, dams, electrical stations, but also churches, schools, hospitals, even maternity wards. UNESCO counts the loss of 163 cultural sites to Russian bombs. Russia is trying to bomb Ukraine out of existence, its people, its culture, its history, its infrastructure. The estimated cost to rebuild Ukraine, if and when the war does end, at this point is an estimated between $500 billion and $1 trillion. $1 trillion is what we spent in Afghanistan and in Iraq each. So the damage is severe. Along the way, Russia and its troops have conducted a textbook war of aggression, to quote my colleague in the law school, Layla Sadat, right? They have engaged in heinous, brutal behavior. Now, the International Criminal Court is investigating numerous charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and has already issued arrest warrants for top Russian leaders, including Putin, former defense minister Sergei Shoigu, and General Valery Gerasimov, but also Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian Commissioner for Children's Rights, for her role in kidnapping Russians' children. Russian soldiers have allegedly tortured, captured Ukrainian fighters, as well as been accused of murder and rape of Ukrainian citizens, butchering farm animals and pets, ransacking homes, stealing food and clothing, destroying and stealing personal property, all of which violate the laws of land warfare. This has been absolutely brutal. Now, the war has had significant ramifications outside Ukraine as well, though. In the region, Russia's early control of the Black Sea meant it blocked Ukrainian grain from reaching world markets that had a demonstrated effect on rising hunger rates in many African countries across the Sahel region, where some Ukrainian wheat winds up. The embargo also wreaked havoc with world food prices, since Ukraine is the largest exporter of grain, one of the world's largest exporters. Russia's naval action in the Black Sea have rattled its maritime neighbors and reignited tensions with Turkey, or Turkaya as it now prefers to go by, over access to the Bosporus Strait, which controls access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Now, beyond the region, the war has forced many Western European countries, such as Germany, to give up its dependence on Russian gas, as well as to start meeting its pledged requirement of 2% of the country's GDP to NATO. As you all know, Finland and Sweden abandoned their decades, even centuries-long neutrality policy and joined NATO to ensure the common defense of their lands, bringing NATO closer to Russia than ever before, the exact opposite of what Putin was hoping to achieve when he launched this war. European states were also forced to confront the embarrassment of having let their armed forces and weapons stocks dwindle and reposition their economies to produce more war materiel. By contrast, Eastern European countries such as Poland and the Baltic states, which are already in a low-level cyber war with Russia, just ask any any Estonian, they have pledged between 4 and 6% of the gross domestic product that might even go higher, as they have undertaken extensive preparations to defend their countries. And I had the honor this summer of attending a talk by the Polish foreign minister who assured us that NATO or no NATO, Poland will never be occupied by Russia again. They are very much committed and they understand the threat here. NATO has moved thousands of troops and military equipment into Eastern European states to shore up that flank and reassure those countries of deterrence. Now, defensive missile batteries are being moved to the region, and there is serious talk of returning US medium-range ballistic missiles to Germany. These are the missiles that sat there throughout the Cold War and were one of the concerns that might have led to a hot war between Russia and the United States during that conflict. Indeed, Russia's foreign minister referred to this conversation and this possibility, and I quote, as destructive to regional safety and strategic stability. And that as a response, Russia would develop a response to this new game, thus raising fear of a missile race in Europe. What happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. Ukraine managed to survive through excellent strategy, adaptive tactics, superb political and military leadership, true grit, Russian ineptitude, and, well, just dumb luck. Ukrainians were and remain incredibly unified in their strong opposition to Russia, even if increasingly exhausted by war. However, it is also very clear that Ukraine would not be standing had it not been for two things: President Biden's political commitment to back Ukraine for massive amounts of Western aid. The UK, the EU, and many European states, which arranged bilateral agreements, have come to Ukraine's defense too. Ukraine has received $270 billion in total aid so far, about $175 billion of which comes from the United States. Over $60 billion of that constitutes military aid. The rest of it comes from Europe and the UK. This has been a united front in supporting Ukraine. The US has shipped to Ukraine enormous amounts of weaponry in both kind and number in over 60 different tranches, according to the Pentagon. These include arms, javelins, Stingers, tow missiles, grenade launchers, hundreds of millions of rounds, rocket launchers, anti-mine equipment, body equipment, helmets. It includes artillery, all kinds of howitzers and mortar systems, including HIMARS and ATACMS. These are different types of rocket systems. Tanks and armored carriers, Abrams, Bradley, Strykers, MRAP. These are mine-resistant vehicles. Air defense systems, Patriots, Hawks, anti-drones, air-to-ground missiles, Sunnis and Hydras, helicopters, combat and explosive drones such as the Switchblade and the Phoenix, surveillance drones, the Scan Eagle, the Puma, the Black Hornet, ground support vehicles, coastal defense, radar and communications equipment, and satellite services. And most recently, as you all know, F-16 fighters have just started arriving, for a total of what will be eventually around 70 of them. And tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been trained on the use of these weapons. This weaponry clearly saved Ukraine from utter defeat. Without the West and President Biden's leadership in Europe to reinvigorate NATO and to reassert the United States as leader of the liberal international order, which was no small feat after 4 years of retrenchment under his predecessor, right? The commitment in the West to back Ukraine, as Joe Biden says, for as long as it takes. Without all of that, Ukraine would surely be a vassal state by now. Now, this must have shocked Putin, since he was counting on the West to abandon Ukraine. As usual, it's never good to bet against the United States and its allies. Now, meanwhile, Russia has spent more and more and has recently moved its economy to wartime footing, allocating as much as 30% of gross domestic product, GDP. That's an unsustainable rate over the long run. That's about what they were spending at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, the West has also heavily sanctioned many sectors of the Russian economy, as well as hundreds of Russian leaders, including Putin himself. While the damage to Russia's economy over the long run is likely to be severe, especially in the high-tech sectors, which will set it back decades, forcing it to fall further behind in its global competition with the United States, Russia has still nonetheless managed to evade the sanctions and survive by oil and gas sales to China and Iran, and from the black market through Turkey. It has managed to survive with help from China, who has sold it precision tools that help Russia manufacture weapons in its extensive weapons factories, which churn out weapons 24/7, and by buying Shahed drones from Iran. It has even bought back decades-old 155 millimeter shells from North Korea, which it sold to during the Cold War. The Russian state has offered high compensation to rural Russian males and from those in the Caucasus and out in Siberia and beyond, who are fooled into thinking that they will get wealthy and survive and that will come home heroes and wealthy, even though, as you all know, most do not. Now, the war finally has had global impact as well. While there have been noted divisions in the UN over support for Ukraine, most countries have condemned Russia in the UN. Russia has been evicted from the world community, including 42 international organizations and agencies, except in the UN, of course, of which they are a founding member. But these range from the G8 to the Olympics. You'll notice there were no Russian athletes as such, under the Russian flag anyway, competing in the Summer Olympics. This makes Russia a pariah state and has forced it to trade on the black market or make end runs on the international sanctions regimes by importing goods from countries like Albania and Central Asian states that Russia has sway over. Russia has severely damaged its foreign relations with dozens of countries, including and especially those in the West. And the war has deepened pre-existing global tensions between liberal and illiberal or authoritarian countries, while accelerating the movement into regional alliance blocks between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea on one hand, right? The axis of autocracies, as they're often called, right? And the US, UK, Europe, and its allies on the other. And all of this will be very familiar to many of you who lived through the Cold War. The liberal international order is fraying, the one that had been the norm since 1945. And all of this then has had significant impact on world politics and will for the foreseeable future. Ukraine may seem far away, but this is really a global war, right? It's quite clear then the costs of war across the board have been high, and that the war in Ukraine has been anything but local or regional, or even exclusively European, but as I said, global. So that's the war and the costs. Where do we stand today? Well, if Russia can continue to throw men and shells at the Ukrainians, which has been the Russian military strategy at least since they fought off Napoleon, and grind them down through a very deadly and costly war of attrition, which does seem to be the strategy, it might break through the front line in this positional warfare and alter the dynamic of war in their favor. What might halt or slow or even reverse Russia's momentum westward would be the arrival and implementation of the latest round of US military aid, including vehicles, Stinger air defense munitions, additional ammunitions for the HIMARS, 155 millimeter artillery, and many other things that are on their way that have just started to trickle in. Now, more likely, these weapons will only help Ukraine return the frontline dynamic to the status quo ante, slowing the slow gains that Russia has been engaged in as of the last few weeks. Thus, it will force Ukraine to explore other options in this positional warfare dynamic. The second new development that might alter the dynamic is the Ukrainian Armed Forces' recent push into the Russian oblast of Kursk in the neighboring regions of Belgorod and Bryansk, where with a full mechanized division of tanks, armored artillery, even missiles, and as many as 1,000 troops, they coordinated with drone strikes on airstrips that Russians were using to launch strikes on Ukraine. This division quickly penetrated through 2 Russian defense lines made up of conscripts and moved over 24 miles into Russia, the first since 1941. And Kursk, of course, was some of the worst fighting in World War II when the Germans invaded it that year. So this area has symbolic and historic significance, and it was probably chosen for that reason. Now, it also claims to control, Ukraine does, to control up to now 500 square miles of Russian territory and control over 100 Russian settlements. They have captured hundreds of prisoners and forced 140,000 Russian citizens to flee. And so this is the area of the Kursk oblast that Ukraine has overtaken. However, you'll also see from the inset that it's not in the lower right-hand corner, that it's a very tiny pinprick area of Russia, which spans 10 time zones. Now, the purpose of this maneuver, or maybe an answer to the question, why did Ukraine invade Russia, is still somewhat unclear, but there are several possible explanations. One is to force the Russians to pull fighters out of the Donbass to protect Russia proper, or their lines, and thereby relieve the pressure on Ukrainian troops there, and thus slowing or halting Russia's advance in the Donbass. Even if that does not happen, the incursion is a huge morale boost for Ukraine troops who have become wary. A second reason is to change the narrative that Ukraine was starting to lose by revealing Russia's weakness. After all, great powers are not supposed to let smaller and weaker adversaries invade their countries. And so this has created something of an embarrassment to Russia and Putin personally, and posed a tactical dilemma. Just how should Russia respond? Now, in particular, with the element of surprise and the ease with which Ukraine took the region, Ukraine has shattered the Kremlin's narrative of inevitable victory, which is what Putin's propaganda has been spreading throughout his own country. This incursion gives hope to the view that Ukraine could win. And of course, the third possibility for invading the territory was that in capturing Russian territory, it could be used as a swap for some Ukrainian territory in potential future negotiations. And this brings us to what the future might look like. So there are 2 things imminently clear at this point as we think about how this might wind up. After 2.5 years of fighting, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have been able to win the conflict outright through kinetic action. But neither side is ready to stop fighting and negotiate a meaningful end to the hostilities. And since the invasion of Kursk, Putin has said all negotiations are simply off the table. He's not interested. There's nothing to negotiate, he said. Until that underlying dynamic changes, that neither can win, but neither is willing to negotiate a meaningful peace, we are likely to see perpetual war. And so the question then becomes, what can be done to change that underlying reality, if anything? Surely there must be something that can be done to break the logjam. And there are a couple possibilities. These are speculative on my part. The first, because no one knows the future, right? So the first is that somehow through more fighting, one side will defeat the other on the battlefield. If you just keep trying, you just keep forcing the other, eventually they'll be forced to sue for peace. Well, this was the thinking in World War I that led to 2.5 more years of war. Early on in World War I, it was clear that neither side was going to win, yet both sides thought that it could, and so it kept fighting in self-defeating tactics. I can find no analyst who thinks that an outright win on the battlefield is a likely outcome. That doesn't mean there aren't those that do think it, but I couldn't find them. Total victory just doesn't seem to be in the cards. It could still happen, sure, But without some dramatic shift in either resources, capability, political change, or some black swan event, it seems unlikely at this point in time. So that seems unlikely. To do more of the same and expect a different outcome is what someone once defined as irrationality. So the second potential future is a negotiated settlement. This is the one that everyone is zeroing in on right now. This could occur if one or both sides determines that it cannot win outright on the battlefield, but also finally tires of the bloody fighting with no victory in sight. Now there's two ways that you could get here. It has two forms. One is a ceasefire, right? A negotiated settlement could be a ceasefire. Now a ceasefire could be either short or long. A ceasefire halts the fighting, but fails to actually resolve the underlying political differences that led to war in the first place. This is, of course, what happened after the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, and eventually led to Russia's full invasion in 2022. That is to say, the two sides failed to build on the two ceasefires to resolve their political differences. So a ceasefire is not going to be enough to really stop this war because we've already seen the ceasefire fail not once, but twice. The other negotiated outcome would be a full-fledged peace agreement that actually stops the fighting, but also addresses effectively the political disagreements, of which, as you know, there are many, including Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. What happens to the area that Russia occupies right now? Do they stay? Do they keep some of it? Do they get all of it? Do they have to get out entirely? Well, that's what they're fighting over right now. How are we going to negotiate that away? Another issue, Ukraine's future security. Ukraine has been promised a path to NATO for over 15 years now, but they still don't have it. Who's going to guarantee Ukraine's security? How about Black Sea access, prisoner exchanges, kidnapped Ukrainian children, financial reparations, Ukraine's relationships with Europe in terms of the EU and NATO? All or any of these things all of these things will have to be diplomatically resolved, and any one of them could sink a negotiated agreement. Now, many analysts see some kind of negotiated settlement in the offing, the only question for them being when. But what they don't say is how all these issues will get worked out. And that's the problem in the first place. And it's no small matter, right? So even if both sides desire a settlement, and even if we here in the West want a settlement, that does not necessarily translate into achieving one. So how are we actually going to get there? And I've seen no one piece of analysis that shows that, at least realistically. And so this leads to the third possibility. And that is, of course, is that there is no resolution at all, with the conflict grinding on in one form or another interminably. And since neither side has enough weapons or manpower or superior strategy and adaptive capabilities to win, nor is willing to negotiate a meaningful settlement, Russia and Ukraine are most likely to keep fighting. In this case, the conflict will continue as a hot war without victory, as both sides exhaust themselves in active battle, but are not willing to relinquish their positions and are still not willing to negotiate. And the costs of war will continue to rise, and we will get more of the same because the underlying structural realities don't change. And that is the outcome that I think is most likely, not because I like it, I disdain it, but it's because what the data seems to show. It is also most likely, I think, because Putin has quite clearly indicated that Ukraine is essential to Russian security. It's essential. He will not live without it. While for Ukraine, their very existence is at stake. And so fighting is existential for them. It's hard to move people off those two basic platforms. So despite well over 500,000 casualties so far, a number that is sure to go much higher, neither have been bloodied enough to relent, nor can bloody the other enough to win. And if there is no military solution in sight, and no diplomatic one is on the horizon, we are forced to accept the rather dismal prospect of perpetual war in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Now, I want to leave you with a slight bit of hope. I am in education, after all. A variation of this outcome is only slightly less dismal, though, is that the situation eventually devolves into a frozen conflict as the two sides exhaust themselves, in which major fighting does stop. There are occasional flare-ups here and there, but at least the costs start to go way down. But the positioning of the two armies and the underlying fundamental dynamics remain unchanged in a frozen conflict. No settlement gets reached. This is what has happened in North and South Korea. It's what happened between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Do you know North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war? They just have a ceasefire. They don't have a full peace agreement. And so either way, it seems to me that conflict in Ukraine is here to stay. And so I'll end with this quote from President Biden. He said, the U.S. must once again, quote, bear the burden of a long twilight struggle. Thank you very much.
It seems to me that this struggle is greatly affected by the willingness of the Western nations to provide more offensive weapons, a greater destructive and longer range attack force, and the political position in China particularly, maybe even India. And I don't know how influential North Korea is, but certainly China. And now that India is starting to talk, it makes you wonder about them too, but I don't know how much financial force they can lend to this. Notwithstanding all that, it seems to me those are such huge uncertainties, and the unwillingness of the West to really contribute what I would consider to be significant offensive weapons to Ukraine. The solution doesn't really depend on what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, but what's going on in Russia, in China, and the United States more than anything else. Do you have any comments on that?
Sure, that's a great question, very eloquent and articulate. Thank you for that. So as regard to the long-range weapons, there's actually some disagreement in the literature about that. Some people think that if you gave Ukraine long-range rockets and artillery and missiles, they could strike deeper into Russia, particularly supply bases and logistic chains, making it harder for the Russians to be able to supply their forces on the front lines. You know, it's a hypothetical, but some military technicians say that's the way to go. You're right that the solution to that particular part of the dynamic lies in Washington, but there are, of course, reasons for why the West doesn't supply those types of weapons, namely because there are bigger issues at stake. For as bad and as problematic as the war in Ukraine has been, the larger goal here is to prevent an even bigger war in Europe. And the concern here is that if we push Putin and the Russian military establishment too far, that the war will expand and Russia will will lash out in other ways. They will up the pressure, and Putin has made it clear that he is not against using a tactical nuclear weapon. A war that expands outside of the Ukrainian borders and or gets into tactical nuclear warfare must be avoided at all costs, is the current administration's thinking. And I happen to agree with it because I think that you open up a can of worms in the possibility of World War III. And this means the Ukrainians have their backs to the wall while they do most of the fighting, and that's why we've armed them to the teeth to defend themselves. But you're right, we're not giving them the weapons to so-called win. But I don't think that in a war of attrition, as I said at the beginning, they just don't have the capability to win. Russia has 180 million people, 4 times the population of Ukraine. They have 10 times the amount of weapons. In a war of attrition, it's just not going to happen. So all Russia would do is move those supply chains and those hubs further back out of range of those rockets or to other sites or underground. And we would be back to playing whack-a-mole. So I'm not at all convinced of the argument that Ukraine can simply win because the West is forcing them to fight with one hand behind their back. I think we're actually allowing them to fight with both hands, but it is in limited asymmetrical ways. And that's just shaped by the nature of the beast, which is that we're dealing with a very volatile great power that's in decline and very angry and very upset about what's happened. And so I think, as unfortunate as it is, we have to contain the problem to Ukraine, and so it doesn't become a regional or world conflict. As for China, I agree. We should be putting even more pressure on China. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just returned from a trip there where he was addressing many other issues. I suspect Russia came up, and they're doing all that they can to pressure China to not provide these machine tools to Russia to make their weapons. But as you know, Putin and Xi Jinping are best buddies. They've had 30 or 40 personal meetings, and Russia and China has a so-called no-limits partnership. There may be only so much we can do with yet another great power, China, in terms of the pressure that we can do here. And so I think the best thing is to do what NATO did over the summer in their 75th anniversary summit in DC, which I had the great fortune of being able to attend this summer, at least some of the events online. And that is to shift the mechanism for supplying weapons and aid out of the United States into NATO and Europe proper, with a guarantee of $45 million of aid every year, which is far short of the $60 billion that the US has supplied, but it is a guaranteed line. And it'll take it out of the control of the US political cycle, and it'll mean that Ukraine will be able to keep fighting for a while. But that will also feed perpetual war. I share your frustration deeply. But I think the bigger concern just has to trump it. Yeah.
Having a family member in Ukraine is what brings me here, and you have enlightened me with your talk, because I'm just an amateur. And my simple question is, with our elections soon to happen, how will it change, the whole strategy?
So whatever your feelings are about the upcoming elections or the two presidential tickets, I would say that the United States and NATO will continue to back Ukraine, regardless of who becomes president, despite what one person says that he wouldn't do. Right. The other candidate has said that she will continue the current administration's policies. She has been frustratingly quiet about details. I think we would all like to hear more on that. But it seems to be working for her as an election strategy to remain at the basic vague level. But the general view is that she will continue Joe Biden's defense of NATO and the liberal international order and continue to support Ukraine, and I have no reason to doubt that. As I said, the mechanism for supplying Ukraine is now shifted to NATO, and European allies are starting to step up. And so I'm fairly confident that Ukraine will be armed going forward, right? And I'm even more so if Kamala Harris is elected. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
I've got a question down here in the front.
Thank you for your terrific talk. It's been so detailed and filled out so much that we need to know. Right at the beginning of this conflict, many commentators I noticed began at the outset in calling it a proxy war. How much do you think that has been borne out over the last 2.5 years?
So that circles back to the first question, which is this a war between Russia and Ukraine or a war between the United States and Russia that's being fought in Ukraine? That's what a proxy war is. I actually think the United States is fighting two proxy wars right now, one in Ukraine and one in the Middle East, in Greater Palestine. And this is partly as a result of having been burned in two intervention wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We as Americans, and I think American political leaders, are now reticent to get into direct hot wars. But we still see there are threats and concerns around the globe from China, from Russia, from smaller rogue states like Iran and North Korea. And so, yes, I do think this is a proxy war. As I said, part of the strategy here that the United States and NATO and European countries and the UK are engaged in is to wear down Russia. There's been many complaints that the sanctions don't work, but the sanctions were never designed to stop the invasion or even necessarily to slow it. They're designed to weaken Russia's infrastructure and its ability to prepare for the next generation of technology. So do you know the best car that Russia can produce now is something equivalent to a 1996 SUV without driver's side airbags? Think about where their auto industry will be in another 20 years, right? As when we're talking about artificial intelligence in 20 years and we're saying, do you remember artificial intelligence? In the way that we now say, do you remember the Y2K, right? Russia will still be getting their first artificial intelligence, right? The point is to make sure that they are weakened so that they can't do much worse damage. And so we are definitely engaged in a proxy war. And back to the China point, we definitely have to send signals to China that large powers simply can't invade other ones. And whatever the complications you want to say about the one China policy, we do have a kind of understanding with Taiwan to come to their defense. It's not an actual defense treaty, but we do have a kind of understanding, or at least an implication. And the signal here to China should be that China cannot simply gobble up Taiwan, even though China thinks that it belongs to it. And of course, that's very controversial, and I'm not going to wade into that debate one way or the other. But I think if you stand firm on Ukraine, then you send a signal to these other great powers that are trying to overturn the liberal international order, that instead the US and its allies are willing to defend the liberal international order. And that's really what Joe Biden's been doing. So I understand that people are upset with him for not sending more weapons to helping Ukraine win, but there are bigger issues at stake here. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be mutually exclusive. We should be able to do both, but it's a very hard razor's edge to walk.
Let's quickly turn to a question from online. With the recent mutual defense treaty between North Korea and Russia, what is the likelihood of North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia in this war?
That's a fantastic question. It's a concern. If Russia, I don't know what the answer is to the likelihood, but it's a concern in that if Russia has been willing, Putin made his first trip, I mean the first of any Russian leader in I don't know how many decades to North Korea, basically on his knees begging for shells. It must have been very embarrassing for the leader of a great power to go to a small, isolated, rogue state like North Korea. So the fact that North Korea was willing to help Russia with these shells, we'll have to wait and see whether that's the limit or whether they're willing to do more and send their own troops. I'm a little dubious of that because North Korea hasn't been known to export its soldiers to other conflicts, at least that I'm aware of, although I'm sure some of you can very quickly Google that and find how I'm wrong. But I think that's not their general policy. And because Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather, the two Kims before him, lord over a paranoid state, they are very much concerned and believe that the U.S. is backing South Korea for an imminent invasion. Now, the U.S. is not planning that, but North Korea believes that's the case. And if that's so, it seems like they'd be unwilling to give up some of their precious fighters. But I really just don't know the answer to that excellent question.
So, over here first.
This may sound simplistic, but if Putin were to fall out a window, what is the feeling among the other Russian leaders about whether they would pursue this?
So one would never wish an unfortunate accident death on another human being, but if there were one, the list is long, but if there were one, he would top it, right? It would certainly be poetic justice. I take your Cold War, your your analogy. Okay, more seriously. So I think it's important to realize here that in a way this is Putin's war, but he also firmly has the Russian national security establishment behind him. And it's also important to realize that history is not on the side of an idea, and I'm not sure if you're suggesting it, but on the possibility that maybe a more enlightened Russian leader would come to power. History is really not on the side of that. For really since Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s, Russia produces autocrats. And Russia, since it was a small Moscow duchy, has done nothing but expand. And after the Cold War, it lost more territory after the Soviet Union disintegrated than it had in several hundred years. But in generally, it's an expansive great power. It doesn't have natural borders, particularly in the West. No one can really say where there's a natural border between where Russia stops and Eastern Europe begins. And that's been part of the problem. Catherine the Great said, if I'm not expanding, then we're stagnating, right? Or something to that effect. And so, you know, this is a Russian, when I say Russian, I don't mean the people, I mean the state. It's a Russian state mindset. The national security mindset is one that is paranoid and insecure and has been for centuries. And Ukraine is existential for them. I think no matter who comes after Putin, would he to die tomorrow, would keep up this war. Because I think Russia is committed to this very idea.
And I'll jump to the question from online since it relates to this. How safe do you think Putin is from internal dissent?
So in authoritarian regimes like Russia that are increasingly dictatorial as Putin's Russia has become, there are 2 or 3 main concerns that autocrats have to face. One, of course, is being invaded from without. That's not going to happen. No one's proposing a direct invasion of Russia to overthrow the regime, except for maybe Zelensky would like it, but they don't have the capability. And so the other 2 concerns then would be a revolution from below or a palace coup from inside the elite. And once again, I think that he has set up such a strong state as his predecessors before him had that, if you even turn out with just a single white piece of paper in Russia, which has come to be the symbol for dissent against this war, you can be sent to prison for 12 years. That makes it very difficult for a revolution from the bottom up. People are just not willing to risk that kind of trip to a Russian prison. And so the only other alternative is a palace coup. And once again, I said I think the Russian mindset is firmly behind Putin. Now that could change if they really think that it's not worth it anymore. But I don't see signs of that right now. But I'm not a Russian expert, and I don't travel there, and I'm willing to leave that as a possibility, but I don't see signs of it. So, yes, sir.
Warfare has changed radically in the last 100 years. In World War I, we were still using horses, and the machine gun came. That got rid of the horses. Today we're having a drone war almost, which has completely changed the way we fight wars, both here and in the Middle East. I know that they're working on new technology that even is more advanced than this. And is there something out there that you know, like I know Israel is working on laser weapons, things that will radically change the way we fight wars in future. There's going to be space wars that we're talking about now. So do you have any knowledge of the newest weapons out there that can change this war and put an end to it?
So despite this bow tie, I do not have access to a secret folder that's kept in a safe in the Pentagon. I wish I did. I think you already touched on several of them. When most of us think of drones, we think of counterterrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan and that kind of stuff. But drone warfare has morphed tremendously and is being used in very creative ways right now in ways that people didn't even imagine 10 or 15 years ago who were doing that. Laser weapons, of course, have been the dream of the United States since Ronald Reagan talked about SDI. And there are laser weapons being tested right now. And so far, the little bit that's dribbled out to the public is indications that they are pretty good. The idea of laser weapons then being exported out into space and being used in a space war is probably not too far off in the distant future. There's also robotics warfare, which we're also using. All 4 major, or 5 or 6, depending on how you want to count, of the United States armed military forces use robotics of different kinds. Robotics have been used to great effect, not just air drones, but sea drones and land drones in Ukraine against Russia. And they will continue to be used, I think, more and more. I think, there's a long history of the future of warfare, and almost all of the predictions by military analysts about what the future of warfare will look like have been wrong, or at least not entirely right. So I'm not going to get on that bandwagon and join them. But I will say one of the things that gives me great pause about shifting more and more of the fighting to different forms of technology is that this will actually make war more acceptable, not less, that it will create more war, not less, that it will prolong war, not shorten war, but it will also not replace human fighting, and that costs of war will remain high. And it's the same argument that we give when we talk about artificial intelligence or machine learning. It will help replace some tasks in the workforce, depending on which workforce, but it will not entirely do away with the worker across the board. Some people will lose jobs, some people will have tasks change. Very few people will be affected at all, or some people will be affected hardly at all. I think the same will happen in warfare and this technology, but there will always be a need for a human being, for decision making and so forth. Despite this use of the term artificial intelligence, for example, which is also being used in warfare, machines can't think. Thinking is a uniquely human activity, and we become anthropomorphic when we assign a human quality to a machine. Now, people who truly understand machine learning know that and understand that. And this means that despite excessively impressively advanced algorithms, we're still always going to need humans to make the most important choices, which is the choice of taking life. And that's really at the root of warfare. So.
Did Prigozhin and the Wagner Group present a real significant threat of overthrowing the Putin regime? And secondly, do you believe that Prigozhin was assassinated upon order of Putin?
Great question. So I certainly think that Putin was caught off guard on the initial rebellion. I think he was surprised by the amount of loyalty and the number of forces that Prigozhin was in control of, able to muster, and how fast they were able to mobilize and start up a path toward Moscow. I think he was equally surprised from what I've been able to discern from the literature, that there was so much discord in the ranks between the regular military generals and the paramilitary leaders, like Prigozhin was, of the Wagner Group, which is one of about 6 or 8 paramilitary groups that Russia uses. I think he was also personally distraught a little that his one-time friend and former confidant would also betray him like that. But he hadn't really betrayed Putin per se, but I think Putin perceived it that way. In terms of the threat, I don't know. I mean, they got about a third or a half of the way up that trek toward Moscow, if memory serves, and who knows what kind of damage they would have been able to do. But they were pretty quickly taken out once the decision to do so. And yes, I do believe that he was assassinated. Yeah. But that's not hard to. Yeah. Over here. Yeah.
So flipping the point of view a little bit, if this war is so important to Putin and they do have the long-range missiles, why haven't they just bombed Ukraine into submission?
So if Russia could win, Why don't they just win? They've used up a lot of those long-range missiles. So if they could have won, it would have been early on. And one of the things that we've learned, and I've talked to several military tacticians here who are on active duty, to the extent that they're able to, what they can reveal that's in the public realm. I think one of the things we've learned is just how atrociously bad the Russian armed forces are. Particularly at logistics. Amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics, and they just didn't support these soldiers well. And they didn't think about how they were going to use, in a coordinated maneuver warfare effort, these long-range missiles with short and medium-range artillery, with on-the-ground armor and tanks, and special forces in a way that worked. And so, like I said, there was just some dumb luck here on Ukraine's part that Russia fumbled this early on, despite Ukraine doing all the right things in the very beginning. But so they still have some. I think mainly if they really wanted to take the rest of Ukraine, they would be resorted to using tactical nuclear weapons. But Putin, I don't think in the end wants to do that. But I think the answer to your question lies in an answer I gave earlier on why the West doesn't give Ukraine more weapons to help take the fight deep into Russia. We're worried about pushing Putin too far, that he will expand the war. Putin is worried about pushing Ukraine too far, us too far, the West and NATO, that he will expand the war. He understands that if this war bleeds out of Ukraine and into a NATO state, in any obvious aggressive way, there's lots of indirect, asymmetrical, small things going on every day at the cyber level and espionage and things you don't hear about all the time. But in a major kinetic way, then he's going to invite a real threat from NATO. And he doesn't want that, right? He too wants to keep this conflict manageable. He's now learned that the best he can do is Eastern Ukraine, 18%. And that's what the fight's over right now. So I think we're just back to the same dynamic that Russia as a great power and the United States and NATO in great power ways don't want a larger conflagration. Russia and Ukraine want to fight it out over who gets Ukraine. Yeah.
All right, we have a question online from Maisie. She says, thank you for your excellent talk. You've spoken about how behind Russia will be in the next 20 years regarding engineering, but they seem to be adept at cybercrime, disinformation, and election disruption. How are they managing to stay ahead in this way, and how significant do you think this will be going forward?
So they're able to get the supercomputer chips that they need through the black market from China or through Central Asian and other states that can buy it legally and then ship it into Russia illegally. And so they can continue their present state of doing things. But as we get more and more control over those chips, and we have a sort of small yard, high fence policy, as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calls it, to control the trade of super high technology. And the more we can control those chips, the more we can prevent Russia from getting the technology they need to do this kind of thing. Now, that said, I don't think any of us are under the illusion that even the best trade or sanctions or fail-safe, airtight mechanisms are going to stop Russia from being able to keep the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Service, and other cyber units that it uses, including that they hire privately that are sort of work in the black space. They're going to continue doing what they're going to continue doing. Russia has penetrated the United States since before World War I with spies and espionage and propaganda and disinformation. As they have European countries, they have meddled in elections. They will assassinate double agents abroad. We've seen that with abundance. And there's no reason why they won't continue doing those things. They may be in decline, but they are still a great power, which means they have a fair amount of power, and they cannot be neglected or cast aside, and nor should they be. We should be looking for ways ultimately to open up lines of negotiation, as distasteful as that may be to many of you, If you do want a negotiated settlement, and I think all of us do, to make this stop, to go back to what Judith said at the beginning, that we're all heartbroken about these conflicts, and we don't want to accept a conclusion, and I hope I'm wrong about perpetual war. And so if we really need to do something, that will mean talking. We don't have to normalize relations again with Russia, but we do need to start looking for off-ramps.
Maybe one more question from the audience here.
This is related to the last one, but you mentioned Estonia is in a low-level cyber warfare with Russia right now. How is that affecting life in countries like Estonia?
So there can be periodic blackouts. Electric grids can shut down. Server at a hospital might go down, at a school, traffic lights. Estonia is one of the world's sophisticated online countries. There's almost nothing you can't do through your phone in Estonia. We were all happy when we got parking apps a few years ago. It's really baby steps for Estonia. They are the most advanced, and they have to be, because they're like thousands of attacks per day. I mean, Russia is aggressively, they want the Baltic states back, starting with Estonia. So they have defenses, but as you all know, the best defense in computers and high tech is only as good as the last attack. And there's always another hacker who's got the capabilities to hack a new system, to get around the next firewall. And it's always a game of whack-a-mole, and it's constant vigilance. They live with it, they manage it, and they have a stiff upper lip. They are remarkable people, and they deserve a lot of credit for being on the front lines, as do the Latvians and the Lithuanians and the Poles and the Moldovans and so many others. And I realize lots of people are watching online, so if I've left out a country in Eastern or Central Europe, I apologize. I love you all. So I hope that answers your question, yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. For being here with us to share your knowledge and your time. It's been very informative, and we really appreciate it. We have an ice cream social next door if anyone would like to join us. We thank the Freedmans for having Dr. Knapp and for supporting us.
Thank you.